every morning before the sun even thought about rising. The military training center was already alive with the sound of quiet effort. The lights flickered on in long, polished hallways, revealing spotless floors that shone like glass and windows so clean they mirrored the first hints of dawn. Most soldiers never thought about who made it that way. They assumed it was just another nameless worker, someone who existed in the background of their strict and noisy world. But there was one man who kept it all in order, a janitor named Samuel. He moved through the halls like a ghost, always there, but never noticed. His uniform was plain gray, his boots soft against the floor, and his posture calm, almost graceful. He never rushed, never grumbled, and when spoken to, he answered with quiet respect. There was something about him, a stillness, a weight behind his silence, but no one ever stopped long enough to wonder what it meant. To most of the officers, he was just the janitor, a man too ordinary to remember. But to those who looked closely, there was something different about his eyes. They held stories no one had heard, stories of nights spent under foreign skies and decisions that changed lives. Admiral Pierce, the man in charge of the entire base, noticed Samuel often, but not for his mystery. The Admiral was proud, loud, and fond of jokes at others' expense. He had spent years commanding soldiers, and with that came a certain arrogance. Every time he saw Samuel cleaning the corridor, he couldn't resist a comment. "You clean floors like you're polishing metals," he'd say with a smirk, his laughter echoing through the empty halls. His subordinates would chuckle too, eager to follow his lead. Samuel never reacted. He would just nod politely, maybe offer a faint smile, and continue pushing his mop, as if the Admiral's words hadn't even touched him. There was no anger in his expression, no offense, just a kind of quiet patience that made Pierce uneasy, though he didn't understand why. Sometimes, as the Admiral passed by, he'd glanced back at the janitor, watching the slow, methodical movements, and feel a strange sense that the man didn't belong in a place like this. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because he seemed to carry himself like someone who had already lived 100 lifetimes. The younger soldiers joked about Samuel too. They called him Old Eagle because he had a habit of pausing by the windows at dawn, staring out toward the horizon as if he was waiting for something or someone. "Maybe he used to be a soldier," one of them said once. "Nah," another replied. "He's too calm for that. Soldiers talk about their war stories. This guy doesn't even talk about the weather." They all laughed and moved on, never realizing how close they were to the truth. What no one knew was that Samuel had indeed been a soldier once, not just any soldier, but one of the most respected operatives in his unit. Years ago, during a classified mission in the mountains of a faraway land, he had earned the codename Lone Eagle. It was a name given only to those who operated alone, who could survive where others couldn't. Samuel had done things few could imagine, saved lives, lost friends, and carried burdens that never left him. But when the mission ended and the medals were handed out, he didn't stay. He left the military quietly, disappearing without farewell or fanfare. Now, in these quiet halls, he found a different kind of peace, one that didn't come from victory, but from silence. Every sound of his mop against the floor, every reflection on the polished surface, was like meditation to him, a small act of control, in a world he once couldn't control at all. Still, even peace has its ghosts. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, Samuel would stop working and look up at the flags hanging in the corridor, the same flags he once fought under. His eyes would soften, not with pride but with something deeper, something unspoken. Then, as if remembering where he was, he would return to his task. Life in the base moved on. Soldiers trained, orders were shouted, and yet Samuel remained the same steady presence, the man who kept the place spotless, the man no one truly knew. But the universe has a way of uncovering truth at the most unexpected times, and soon, Those same officers who laughed at the janitor would learn that Old Eagle wasn't a joke. The man they walked past every day without noticing wasn't just cleaning floors. He was carrying the weight of stories too heavy for metals, too sacred for words. His name had once been spoken with honor in rooms Admiral Pierce could only dream of entering. But for now, Samuel kept his secret, pushing his mop quietly down the shining halls, waiting for the day when the past would rise again and remind everyone who he really was, Lone Eagle. The morning began like any other at the military base, the sound of boots echoing down metal corridors, the smell of coffee mixing with the sharp scent of disinfectant, and the low murmur of conversation among officers in the mess hall. Admiral Pierce entered with his usual confidence, followed by a group of young officers who admired him like a legend. He carried himself like a man who owned the place, his uniform perfectly pressed, his medals glinting under the fluorescent lights. The men around him laughed easily, hanging on to his every word as they filled their trays with breakfast. Near the back of the room, away from all the noise and pride, Samuel was quietly mopping the floor. His gray uniform looked dull next to the officer's crisp blues, but he didn't seem to mind. He moved slowly, his motions steady and precise, the mop gliding smoothly over the tiles as if he'd done this dance 1,000 times before. He didn't look up when the group entered. He rarely did. He had learned long ago that attention from people in power usually brought nothing but trouble. But Admiral Pierce noticed him. He always did. There was something about Samuel's quietness that irritated him, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the calm way the man carried himself, the way he seemed unbothered by anyone's rank or tone. To Pierce, it almost looked like arrogance. The Admiral, in a half-playful, half-mocking mood, smirked and said loudly enough for the room to hear, "So, Janitor, what's your code name? Mop Master, or maybe Captain Bucket?" The officers around him burst into laughter, some trying to hide it, others slapping each other on the back, as if it were the funniest thing they'd heard all week. Samuel paused mid-swipe, his mop resting lightly against the floor. For a few seconds, he didn't move. The laughter echoed through the hall, bouncing off the walls, but when it finally died down, the silence that followed felt heavy. Samuel straightened slowly and looked up at the Admiral. His eyes were calm, not angry, not hurt, just steady, like deep water that could hide anything beneath. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but clear. It used to be Lone Eagle. The room froze. The laughter stopped instantly, caught in the throats of the officers who hadn't expected an answer. The words hung in the air like smoke, faint but impossible to ignore. For a second, no one moved. Admiral Pierce raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering for just a moment, before returning. "Lone Eagle, huh?" he said, forcing a laugh. "That's a good one. Maybe I'll call you that from now on." The others joined in, chuckling awkwardly, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. But Samuel didn't react. He didn't smile, didn't frown. He simply lowered his eyes again and returned to mopping, the soft swish of the mop filling the uncomfortable silence. The Admiral turned back to his officers, trying to keep the mood light, but something in Samuel's tone stayed with him. There had been no sarcasm, no humor, just a quiet statement. It used to be Lone Eagle. As Pierce sat down with his tray, he found himself glancing back toward the janitor. The man was humming softly now, an old tune that sounded almost military in rhythm, slow, steady, familiar. The sound sent a strange feeling through the Admiral, like he'd heard it before, but couldn't remember where. The other officers soon forgot the moment, but Pierce couldn't. Throughout breakfast, as laughter and conversation picked back up, his mind kept returning to those two words, Lone Eagle. It sounded official, like a calcine, the kind used for elite operatives or covert agents. He had spent decades in service and had heard hundreds of code names, but that one it carried weight. When he glanced again, Samuel was wringing out his mop, his movements deliberate, His posture relaxed. There was no sign of embarrassment or resentment. He seemed perfectly at peace, as though the entire exchange had meant nothing. And yet, there was something in his eyes, something Pierce recognized but couldn't place. It wasn't defiance, nor submission. It was the kind of stillness that came from someone who had seen far too much and learned not to speak of it. The Admiral tried to shake the thought away. Just an old man with too much imagination, he muttered to himself, but even as he laughed softly, the words didn't feel convincing. He had met heroes, soldiers, spies, men who had seen the worst of humanity and lived to tell about it, and they all had the same look in their eyes as Samuel, a calmness that wasn't peace but acceptance. The rest of the day passed like any other, drills, meetings, paperwork, but the janitor's voice lingered like a whisper in the back of his mind. When night came and the halls emptied, Pierce walked past the corridor Samuel usually cleaned. It gleamed as always, spotless and perfect. The Admiral stopped, staring at the reflection of his own face on the polished floor, and found himself wondering who was this man they all laughed at, and why did the name Lone Eagle sound like something he should have remembered. That afternoon, long after the laughter in the mess hall had faded, Admiral Pierce found himself sitting alone in his office, unable to focus on the stack of reports in front of him. The base was quiet except for the low hum of air vents and the faint clatter of boots outside his door, but his mind was stuck on two words that refused to leave him: Lone Eagle. He had heard thousands of code names throughout his career, but that one had an odd weight to it, a familiarity that gnawed at the edges of his memory. The janitor's calm voice echoed again in his thoughts, steady and unshaken, like a man who didn't need to prove anything. Pierce frowned and leaned back in his chair. He told himself it was nothing, just a coincidence, yet curiosity began to coil in his chest. Finally, he stood, walked to his terminal, and entered his credentials into the classified personnel database, a system that only high-ranking officers could access. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. He hesitated, half amused at himself for letting an old janitor's words get under his skin. But curiosity pushed him forward. He typed in the search, Lone Eagle. For a long second, the screen flickered, loading through endless security filters. Then, to his surprise, a single file appeared. The header glowed red, Restricted Operation Falcon Rain. His eyes narrowed. The name struck a chord somewhere deep in his mind. Operation Falcon Rain. It had been whispered about years ago. A mission so dangerous and secret that most of its details had been buried under layers of clearance. Many officers had speculated about it, but no one really knew what had happened. Pierce had been a junior officer back then, far from the level needed to know such secrets. He exhaled slowly and opened the file. A wave of old military documentation filled the screen: mission reports, debriefing transcripts, photos taken from mountain ranges buried in snow and smoke. And then he saw it, the picture that froze him in his seat. It was a black and white image, grainy but clear enough to see the man standing in the middle of it, battered, covered in dust and blood, yet standing tall as a rescue helicopter hovered behind him. His face was older now, worn by time, but it was unmistakably him, Samuel, the janitor. The man who quietly cleaned the hallways every morning was staring back at him from the screen, dressed in combat gear, holding a rifle with steady hands. His expression in the photo was the same as it was now, calm, focused, eyes full of something deeper than fear. The caption below, the photo read, Staff Sergeant Samuel H. Carter, Codename, Lone Eagle, Mission, Operation Falcon Rain. Status commended for extraordinary bravery in the field. Pierce's throat tightened as he scrolled further. The file detailed an impossible story: a team ambushed in hostile mountains during a blizzard, communication cut off, extraction delayed for 3 days. Most of the unit had been injured or trapped. Against orders, Lone Eagle had trekked alone through enemy territory to get a signal out, carrying 2 wounded soldiers on his back for miles. The report said he returned with the rest of the team alive, 23 men rescued because of his decision. He had received multiple medals, but after the mission, he had turned down every promotion offered to him. Within months, he had resigned from active service and disappeared from all records. No known address, no known family, no reason why. The file ended there. Pierce sat frozen, the glow of the monitor lighting his face. He didn't know what to think. The janitor he had mocked that morning, the man who pushed a mop and swept the floors of his base, had once been one of the military's greatest heroes, a man who had done what others couldn't. But why would someone like him end up here, cleaning after men who didn't deserve to carry his shadow? Pierce leaned back in disbelief, running a hand through his hair. His heart beat faster as memories came flooding in, the way Samuel had stood so calmly when mocked, the stillness in his eyes, that faint hum of an old tune. It all made sense now. That was the stillness of a soldier who had seen the edge of death and returned from it. The hum was probably an old march, something from his unit. The Admiral suddenly felt ashamed. He thought of the way the officers had laughed, the smugness in his own voice. He looked again at the photo, the man standing against the storm, carrying the wounded, the same man who now carried a mop with quiet dignity. Pierce's chest tightened. He couldn't understand it. Why would a hero live as a janitor, hidden in plain sight? Was it guilt? Loss? Maybe he just wanted peace, a life free of orders and death. Whatever the reason, the Admiral realized something he hadn't in years. True greatness doesn't need medals or recognition. It exists quietly, in the shadows, wearing a gray uniform instead of a decorated one. He stared at the screen one last time, whispering the codename aloud, Lone Eagle, before closing the file. The room felt heavier now. He turned off the monitor, but the image of Samuel standing in that snow-covered battlefield stayed burned behind his eyes. The Admiral had read thousands of reports in his life, but none had ever shaken him like this. That night, as he left his office and walked down the same polished halls Samuel cleaned every morning, he couldn't help but feel smaller, and for the first time, when he saw the janitor's mop and bucket waiting by the door, he didn't see a tool of service. He saw the weapons of a man who had already fought his greatest battle. The next morning broke cold and gray, the kind of dawn that seemed to hang heavy in the air. Frost clung to the metal railings, and the breath of every soldier passing by turned into thin white clouds that vanished too quickly. Admiral Pierce stepped out of his office earlier than usual, his mind still haunted by the discovery from the night before. The name Lone Eagle echoed in his thoughts like a heartbeat, steady and inescapable. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Samuel's face, not the quiet janitor's face, but the one from the old photograph in the classified file. The face of a man standing in a storm, bloodied but unbroken. As Pierce walked down the steps leading to the courtyard, he stopped in his tracks. There, kneeling on the icy concrete, was Samuel, his mop and bucket beside him, cleaning the steps as the sky lightened to pale blue. His gray uniform looked thin against the cold, his movements slow but deliberate. The Admiral watched him for a moment, and for the first time, he didn't see a janitor. He saw a soldier, a man carrying the invisible weight of 100 memories. The realization made Pierce's chest tighten. He took a deep breath and approached quietly, his boots crunching against the frost. Samuel looked up, and for a moment, the two men simply stared at each other. The janitor's breath fogged in the morning chill, but his expression was calm, steady, like always. The Admiral spoke softly, his voice stripped of rank and pride. "Why are you here?" he asked. Samuel paused, resting his hand on the mop handle. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he exhaled slowly and said, "Because here, nobody dies." The Admiral frowned, not sure he understood. Samuel straightened, his movements deliberate, and looked out across the base. Soldiers marching, vehicles rumbling, the faint sound of orders shouted in the distance. I've seen enough men die, Admiral, he continued quietly. Out there, it doesn't matter how strong you are, how brave you think you can be. Death doesn't care about medals or ranks. It takes good men just the same. I couldn't carry that anymore. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet sorrow in it, like a wound that had healed on the surface, but never inside. The Admiral said nothing, afraid to interrupt. Samuel's eyes seemed distant, fixed on something only he could see. I lost my whole unit, he went on, his tone steady but heavy. Every one of them. We went into that mountain thinking we'd bring everyone home. Only I did. That's why they called me Lone Eagle, the last one flying. He gave a faint, humorless smile. After that, I didn't want to fight anymore. I didn't want to win anymore. I just wanted peace. The Admiral's throat tightened. He could hear the truth in every word. Samuel turned back, toward the steps, dipping the mop into the bucket again. This job, he said, it may look small to you, but to me, it's something that matters. Every floor I clean, every hallway I sweep, it's a place safe enough for others to walk without fear. Here, no one dies because of what I do. That's enough for me. The Admiral felt the air catch in his chest. For years, he had measured strength by medals, promotions, and victories, but now, standing before this quiet man, he saw strength of a different kind, the kind forged not in battle, but in loss and humility. Peace, Samuel said after a moment, still working, isn't given by medals, sir. It's earned by learning to live with what you've seen. His words hung in the air, soft but powerful. The Admiral could only stand there, speechless, watching him. The morning light grew stronger, spilling gold over the base, and in that light, Samuel looked almost out of place, a relic from another time, a soldier who had chosen silence over glory. Pierce finally spoke, his voice quiet. You could have been anything, Samuel. You could have commanded men, trained them, led them. Samuel stopped mopping and looked at him, his expression gentle but firm. And what would that change? He asked. I've already led men into battle. I've already watched them fall. Leading more won't bring peace, sir. But this, he gestured around him, this is honest work. It keeps my hands busy, and my mind quiet. The Admiral looked at him with new eyes, realizing that this man, this janitor, he had mocked, carried a wisdom deeper than any rank could teach. There was no bitterness in Samuel's voice, only acceptance, the rare kind that comes after years of wrestling with pain. The Admiral straightened slowly, a weight settling in his chest. I mocked you, he said, his voice low. And yet, I don't think I've ever met a stronger man. Samuel simply nodded, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. Strength isn't about how loud you shout, sir, he said quietly. It's about how quietly you stand. The two men stood there for a while, the silence between them filled not with tension, but with understanding. When the Admiral finally turned to leave, he looked back once more. Samuel had returned to cleaning, the mop sliding rhythmically across the steps, his breath still visible in the cold air. But this time, when Admiral Pierce looked at him, he didn't see a janitor at all. He saw a soldier, still serving, not with weapons or orders, but with purpose and peace. From that morning on, something in the base changed quietly, but deeply. The next time Samuel walked through the halls with his mop and bucket, the laughter that once followed him was gone. Instead, soldiers nodded respectfully as he passed, and young recruits, who had once ignored him, now stood a little straighter. They didn't know the full story, but they had heard enough to understand that the quiet man who cleaned their floors had once walked through fire for others. The name Lone Eagle began to whisper through the base like a legend reborn. No one dared to call him the janitor anymore. Even Admiral Pierce, a man known for his commanding tone, now spoke to Samuel with a kind of humility that few had ever seen in him. Some mornings, the Admiral would leave his office early, not to give orders, but to walk alongside Samuel as he worked. The two men would talk, not about ranks or operations, but about life, about loss, and about the kind of peace that comes after the storm. Pierce would often ask him about the mission, about the days when he was Lone Eagle, but Samuel never spoke of it again. He would only smile and say, "Some things don't need retelling, Admiral. They just need remembering." The Admiral understood. What Samuel had endured didn't belong in stories told for glory. It belonged in silence, the kind of silence that teaches. Over time, others began to notice the small things about him. How he treated everyone with the same quiet respect. How he never raised his voice. How his work was always perfect, but never rushed. There was a peace about him that spread to everyone who crossed his path. New soldiers who arrived at the base were told, "If you want to understand discipline, watch him," and they did. They watched how he took pride in even the smallest task, how he seemed to move with purpose, no matter how ordinary the job seemed. Weeks turned into months, and Samuel's presence became a part of the rhythm of the base, steady, grounding, familiar. One evening, as the sun set behind the barracks, a few officers sat around talking, and one of them said quietly, "You know, I think Lone Eagle still serves. He just found a new way to do it." No one disagreed. They all felt it too, that his quiet example had changed them, made them think differently about what it meant to wear the uniform. Samuel, without ever trying, had reminded them that courage wasn't only shown on battlefields. It could live in the hands that cleaned and repaired, in the hearts that chose peace over pride. The months passed, and one morning, word spread that Samuel was retiring. The news hit the base harder than anyone expected. Soldiers who had never spoken to him personally felt a strange sadness. It wasn't just about losing a worker. It was about losing the quiet strength that had become part of the place itself. On his last day, the entire base gathered outside the main hall. The morning air was cool, and the golden light of dawn fell softly over the crowd. Samuel stood at the bottom of the steps in his gray uniform, mop and bucket set aside for the first time. He looked a little surprised by the turnout, a little shy, as if he didn't think he deserved all this attention. But to the men and women who had come to see him off, it wasn't just a farewell, it was gratitude. Admiral Pierce stepped forward, his voice steady, but thick with emotion. "Samuel," he said, "you reminded us what real honor looks like. You showed us that a man's value isn't in his rank, but in his heart." The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on the man who had taught them so much without ever trying to. Samuel smiled softly and looked at the Admiral. "Real honor," he said quietly, "isn't what you do when no one's watching." The simplicity of his words hit everyone in a way no speech ever could. The Admiral saluted, a full, formal salute, and for a moment, the sound of boots and murmurs faded until there was only the crisp stillness of respect. Samuel returned the salute, then picked up his coat and turned toward the gate. As he walked away, the morning sun caught the freshly polished floors behind him, and the light reflected in a golden shimmer, as though the base itself was saying goodbye. The soldiers watched until he disappeared around the corner, and then, almost without realizing it, they all stood a little taller. From that day on, the halls he had cleaned seemed to hold a quiet echo of his presence. New recruits would still hear stories of Lone Eagle, not as a soldier from the past, but as the man who had taught an entire base what it meant to serve with humility. And somewhere beyond those gates, Samuel walked into his new life, peaceful, unseen, and free, leaving behind a legacy as spotless and enduring as the floors he had once kept shining.